This is a radio broadcast addressed from the League of Nations on the global war effort against the Morgana threat, where we report the recent happenings amongst the major nations contributing to the defense of our united front. First up, we turn our attention towards the Mediterranean to hear the latest from Italy, who is yet again the world's leading nation in combating the Morgana threat. As the Regia Marina takes a much-needed rest from their non-stop actions in and around the Mediterranean, the Italian government shifted their focus back to the matters on land, continuing to work towards extending Italy's influence over the Balkans and Eastern Mediterranean, more generally in the service of the Imperio Novo. The Inner Council decided upon the war plan High Culture as the best method for achieving this goal, and unlike previous plans, emphasizes the velvet glove rather than the iron fist. Following the plan's enactment, the Istituti Italiani di Cultura all'Estero opened its doors a bit earlier than planned in Belgrade, and the Società Dante Alighieri hosted events to foster friends, or at least made efforts to make friends in Athens and Istanbul. The glories of Italian culture were given bright spotlights across the Balkans for all to see. Overall, it was successful as a goodwill effort as far as it went, although reports say that it led some observers in Yugoslavia, Greece, and Turkey to suspect that Italy wasn't quite prepared to push them as hard as they previously feared. Following that comes news from the other side of the Atlantic with the United States, who is the second leading nation contributing to our united front. After the United States' successful operations in the Atlantic and Pacific over these past 2 weeks, word arrived in Manila that the Japanese were staring down a massive Morgana fleet off the north coast of Formosa. Upon hearing this, the powers that be within the United States government convened, voted upon, and passed the war plan No Rest for the Wicked with a 77% majority. The United States government resolved to finish the fight, and the Pacific Fleet resolved to finish that fight too. Despite the Pacific Fleet being at the end of their logistical chain, they set out almost immediately following the Battle of Manila. Nearing Formosa, the American battle fleet arrived out of the east, having seen the smoke of the battle long before. Reports state that the Japanese had split the Morgana fleet into 2 groups, one north and one south. Both were disorganized, but the Japanese had effectively pinned themselves between the 2 groups. And judging by the ragged fire coming from the Japanese ships, it was apparent that they were nearly exhausted. The Pacific Fleet chose to engage the northern group, which was covering the entrance to Kiran, so that they may provide the Japanese a way out, and they immediately set about the work of demolishing the enemy. Intuiting what the American plan was, IJN Nagato and her fleet steamed northward as the Americans cleared them an escape path. After the Japanese retired, the United States Navy found no shortage of Morgana, however. No sooner than the northern Morgana group had been destroyed did the southern group finally form something of a line. Toward sunset, both sides began running desperately low on ammunition. A murder rammed USS Maryland out of desperation, creating a large gash in her side and leaving a significant chunk of her bow embedded in USS Maryland. Nearing the end of their ammunition supply, and with every battleship having taken some damage, the Americans prepared to disengage and make for Kiran themselves before they were overwhelmed. Fortunately, however, a light squadron of British ships led by HMS Birmingham provided just the right amount of energy and initiative to finally break the Morgana will. Steaming out of the west at a head full, they blew apart the nearest 2 cruisers, and the rest of the Morgana simply turned tail and fled at the surprise attack. The Americans and British subsequently entered Kiran together in triumph. Upon entering Kiran, Nagato herself personally expressed her thanks to each ship in turn, provoking some complaints in the crew that they hadn't had the appropriate time to turn out their best for her review. As for the aftermath done in the naval battle outside of Formosa, the damage the Pacific Fleet received was quite extensive. USS Cummings was sunk by Morgana torpedo bombers just before sunset on November 11th, and of greater concern was the ammunition supply, which couldn't be replenished at Kiran except for light weaponry. The fleet would need to make Manila to replenish, and that meant crossing the Morgana-infested Philippine Sea. For now, however, they would repair as much as possible, so that they may be prepared for the arduous journey ahead. After that comes news from Germany, who has become the 3rd contributing nation in combating the Morgana threat, surpassing even the United Kingdom's efforts now. Is this a sign that Germany is starting to come around to the idea of a united front to become a global leader, or is this simply just a show of force? Following the actions last week, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht debated how best to use the Kriegsmarine in their planned Westfeldzug. Sources say the wishes of the Führer were that the fleet remained in port to preserve strength and resources to support the Heer. However, the Oberkommando der Marine urged a continued presence in the Baltic despite the relative lack of Morgana raids in the Old and New Reichsgau. Admiral Vader broke the impasse by creating facts of his own, in which he executed the war plan to end starvation with 78% of the Kriegsmarine in support. From this, a Kriegsmarine force joined with the Soviets and ran starvation to ground just west of Hiiumaa, bringing a measure of calm to the southeastern Baltic and freeing lines of trade that had been paralyzed for weeks. Soviet captains were grateful for the support, but to those of German military command in Berlin, outrage may be too soft of a word. Acting on their own accord and against the wishes of the Fuhrer at such an important time could be seen as borderline treasonous, to say the least. Although the propaganda apparatus made the most of it publicly, spinning the tale of a selfless act against the Morgana, where they saved a Soviet detachment in need of desperate aid and freed up trade for all of the Baltics to benefit from. Truly opportunistic propagandists after my own heart. Privately, Admiral Vader's emphasis on destroying starvation instead of preparedness for the future naval operations was part of a pattern that could no longer be tolerated, reports say. It was whispered in some quarters that Vader was on his way out. However courageous Vader's actions were, starvation's absence left a void soon filled by the Morgana treason, who made herself known not in combat, but by silently showing herself just out of the range of the shore guns all along the Baltic. An eerie image, to be sure, but one that likely brings an even eerier omen. Following that, we head across the North Sea to hear news from the United Kingdom, the fourth contributing nation in our war against the Morgana. This week, the United Kingdom's greatest advances and greatest risks were taken in the far Pacific. Royal Navy forces at HMS Tamar had taken note of the impending battle between the Imperial Japanese Navy and a major Morgana force off the north coast of Formosa. The British Parliament resolved to send aid to their friends in need. With approval from His Majesty, the Prime Minister announced the enactment of War Plan Hello from Birmingham, in which the 21st Destroyer Flotilla, led by HMS Birmingham, was sent to aid the Japanese at Formosa. Reports say smoke from the battle was easy to spot as they drew nearer. The 21st Destroyer Flotilla arrived in the afternoon of the 11th, and to their surprise found an American battle line nearly exhausted. Their sporadic fire was serving mostly to deter the gathering Morgana. Birmingham and her destroyers, fresh and ready for battle, steamed at a head full to confront the enemy and to aid their beleaguered friends. They had only to sink 2 cruisers before the enemy finally gave up exhausted. The remaining Morgana fled east as the Americans and British steamed into Keyron and to the shelter of the shore guns. No British ships were lost in the naval action. The battle was a triumph in the end, and the Japanese seemed appropriately grateful. Ijaya Nagato herself personally expressed her thanks to each ship in turn, the Madalos proudly showing off their, albeit light, battle damage and admiring her quite heavy damage in return. A great deal was learned about Japanese capabilities and tactics at sea. Something of the Royal Navy's own capabilities and tactics, however, were also revealed. Meanwhile, further south, the Royal Navy station at HMNB Singapore was notified that its duties would now be expanded to include regular patrols and other services, should the events warrant them, off the coast of French Indochina. London wasn't deaf to the arguments that the Royal Navy was being stretched rather thin as it was, while simultaneously having reports coming in that Morganas were swarming into the Bay of Bengal. But the French needed the help, and the commercial concessions were rather enticing. Closer to home, HMS Blanche, assigned to the 19th Destroyer Flotilla, was escorting HMS Adventure in the English Channel on the 13th of November when they suddenly struck a mine and capsized around 9:50 a.m. local time. Reports stated that there was only 1 fatality, with several others injured from Blanche's sinking, who was subsequently rescued by her sister ship HMS Basilisk. Whether it was a German or Morgana mine is unknown as of this time. Now, over to the Pacific to hear news from the Empire of Japan, the 5th-ranking nation contributing to the defense of our united front. With a large Morgana force massing off the coast of Formosa and the Funayuri fire attempting to play in the southern waters of Japan, the Imperial Japanese Navy had to make a risky decision. With 69% in favor, captains of the Imperial Japanese Navy decided on the war plan Battle of the East China Sea, fighting fire, diverting a small detachment from the Second Fleet away from Formosa to handle fire. The forces diverted to repel the Funayuri fire accomplished their task rather easily, leaving a string of smoking hulks barely visible to the fishermen of western Kumishima early in the morning of November 11th. Meanwhile, the Second Fleet arrived off the coast of Formosa at dawn later that same day, catching the massing Morgana completely unaware. The enemy had spent much of the 10th dueling the coastal defenses of Taioku with some losses, and I.J. and Nagato's arrival found them unprepared for battle. Without hesitation, she divided the enemy and engaged them on both sides, with the 4th and 8th cruisers supporting her. Perhaps because the Morgana lost their flagship almost immediately, or perhaps because their fleet was divided, they never fully regrouped and instead continued to send small, unsupported divisions into the teeth of the Second Fleet's guns. By late morning, however, the ammunition situation had become dire. Worse even, the northern group of Morgana covered the approaches into Kirun. Nagato's gambit had successfully thrown the Morgana into disarray, but it had also trapped the Japanese fleet. It's possible that the fleet would have been destroyed in its entirety were it not for the timely arrival of the Americans, who arrived from the east and immediately engaged the Morgana group to the north. Even as she fired the last of her shells, Ajay and Nagato was able to retire into Kirun for resupply, thanks to the path the Americans cleared for her. The United States Navy was able to defeat the northern Morgana and much of the group to the south before they also ran out of ammunition. Fortunately, the surprise appearance of a small British squadron precluded disaster. In the end, and thanks to this surprise joint effort, no Japanese ships were lost. The victory, which happened within eyesight of much of the port, spread rapidly throughout the island, a clear mark of the strength of the Emperor. Certain admirals who prided themselves on taking the long view noted that the Americans and the British had learned more about Japanese tactics and armaments than was completely ideal. But of course, Japan had been given the chance to study them as well. After that, we head west to hear from our comrades in the Soviet Union, who, through much effort and for the first time, have become the 6th-ranking nation contributing to our united front. It may not look like much to some, but it must certainly be a big boost to Soviet morale. The Soviet week began with the harrowing of the prime starvation in the region. The Baltic Fleet chased her from the Gulf of Finland and southwest to the Estonian archipelago, where, with unexpected help from the Kriegsmarine, they shattered her personal fleet and a second group of Morgana from the Gulf of Riga. In the end of the chase, as she thrashed and cursed, sank her. Sources say that she swore revenge with her literal last breath. As the Baltic Fleet began the return journey to port, however, the situation took a strange turn. Reports state that their radio officers began receiving a series of encrypted riddles. When decrypted, they appeared to be complete nonsense until S3 realized that they were in fact coordinates leading to the Gulf of Bothnia, and that they had been sent by the Finnish belle Väinämöinen. Despite being on the precipice of war, the fleet gambled that it was not a trap and made best speed north. Passing through the Sea of Åland, they were joined silently by FNS Väinämöinen, who alleged that other Finnish ships had been corrupted by the Morgana, their crews made half-mad or worse, and that these ships were delivering some payload from the Morgana destruction to somewhere on the Austro-Bothnian coast. Väinämöinen herself had been woken in the attack by destruction, and had been able to save her own crew, but could not protect Finland alone. Battle was joined on the afternoon of November 14th with a squadron of destructions led by a group of hideously contorted Finnish merchant vessels and the gunboat Turun Maa. Even with the assistance of FNS Väinämöinen, it was a hard fight. The destroyer Voldarski was lost when 2 of the converted merchants rammed her, and 2 other destroyers, Artyom and Karl Marx, took quite enough damage to prove their crew's courage. But in the end, the improvised joint Finno-Russo task force won the battle. However, negotiations to avert war took a dark turn in the aftermath of the battle. The Finnish delegation claimed that the Baltic Fleet had hunted and destroyed Finnish vessels without provocation. The Soviets responded that the Finns had colluded willingly with destruction and had paid the price. It was unclear where the truth lay to the outside world, but what is clear is that the tensions between the Soviets and Finland are reaching their boiling point. Hopefully, war can be avoided, but it's looking more and more unlikely as time goes on. Lastly, we turn our attention to Western Europe to hear news from France, the 7th contributing member to our united front. Hard times seem to have befallen our French brothers and sisters, as it seems their efforts have been dwindling recently, perhaps in the face of the increased Morgana threat, or perhaps their neighbor. Hopefully they can recover before the Morgana or someone else claims them. This week, Deladier's government announced the enactment of War Plan Hidden Whispers, La Manche, which found 79% support. Subsequently, the Marine Nationale ordered the second destroyers out from Brest, with specific instructions on times and depth at which to deliver depth charges. At first, the exactness of the instructions was disregarded, but when the second series of depth charges raised U-45, the French began following the instructions to the second. By the end of the patrol, FN Eldroit had become the leading Allied ship in submarine kills. Strict adherence to orders enabled her to sink U-45, U-12, and U-16. Among the crews involved, there was a fair amount of debate among the source of the intelligence. The hypothesis that enjoyed the most support was that it was the Americans, keeping their involvement secret in the name of protecting their complicated position of neutrality, though that raised the question of how they might know so precisely the location and depth of the enemy. At any rate, it was fitting revenge for the raids in Biscay. There was some cause for anxiety, however. Both Mischief in Biscay and Despair in the Alboran had begun strengthening their grip on these waters. Mischief could generally be relied upon to torment but not destroy civilian shipping. Despair, on the other hand, was not so forgiving in this matter. And with that concludes the League of Nations War Report for Week 3 of November. Despite tensions running high, we here at the League of Nations would like to thank you for continuing to aid one another in the face of our alien invaders. Only through these joint efforts can we truly achieve victory for all of humanity, and send these unwanted pests to their watery graves. And as a reminder to all captains and citizens alike that this League of Nations broadcast is intended on keeping you informed about the unified war effort against the Morgana. But there is more you can do to help both on the front and at home. Has a captain or belle caught your eye? Utilize some of that prestige that you've earned to get them a tailored uniform or some nice formal dress wear from your local tailor. If you find yourself lacking in prestige to woo your fellow officers, consider buying some war bonds to help the war effort against the Morgana. This is the quickest way to support our boys and girls on the front line, while also netting you fame among your peers that you can use to get that special someone regalia befitting only of them. Thank you for listening, and may you have smooth seas.